A restless wind rattled the old window panes, slanting rain against the weathered clapboards of Becky's farmhouse. It was the kind of winter night that pressed on your chest and whispered old fears into the corners. Becky tossed under the thin covers, her eyes chasing the clock's red digits. 2:43 a.m. Sleep was as far away as her ex-husband, as far as the laughter that once filled these rooms. Only the house creaked now, shifting in the storm, and Becky lay still, fighting the feeling of being entirely, utterly alone. Then, Ranger barked. It wasn't the usual woof when a raccoon rustled the trash. No, this was frantic, a warning, wild and sharp. Paws hammered the back door, claws scraping, desperate. Becky shot upright, pulse pounding, her mind racing through every headline she'd ever read about break-ins and strangers and women living alone. Damn dog, she thought, angry at him for scaring her, angry at herself for being scared at all. But Ranger wouldn't quit. He spun, snarling at the door, his hackles up. Becky grabbed her robe, cinching it with a trembling hand. "Ranger, hush! It's just the storm!" Her voice wavered, lost in the howl of wind and the steady tattoo of rain on glass. Ranger looked at her with wild eyes, then whined, a low, urgent plea, and rammed the door again. Lightning split the night, spotlighting the yard in ghostly blue. Becky's heart jackhammered as she flipped the deadbolt and eased the door open, bracing herself against the rush of cold air. Ranger bolted outside, paws splashing through mud, nose pointed like an arrow toward the ancient oak tree at the edge of her yard. The oak stood massive and brooding, branches clawing at the sky. Becky shivered, drawing her robe tighter, and followed Ranger out. Mud oozed between her toes as she stepped onto the porch, the storm soaking her thin slippers instantly. Ranger's barking had changed, a deep guttural growl now, his entire body rigid as he circled the tree. "Ranger, what's wrong with you?" "Get back here," Becky hissed, fear and anger twisting inside her. But Ranger only dug his paws in and stared up at the oak, then at the ground beneath it. Becky's gaze followed his, and a chill ran down her spine. Even in the rain she could see it. The earth at the base of the tree was disturbed. Fresh scratches marred the bark, gouges trailing downward. The dirt was loose, darker, as if something or someone had been digging there. She hesitated, every childhood nightmare crawling back up from memory. Monsters, men with knives, stories her grandmother told about restless spirits in the woods. Becky shook her head, jaw set. She was done being afraid of shadows, done letting the past run her life. But as she took a step closer, Ranger pressed himself against her legs, growling deep in his chest, refusing to let her move forward alone. "Okay, boy. Okay." She crouched beside him, her hand trembling as she stroked his wet fur. The storm's roar seemed to hush, all the world narrowing to the two of them, alone under that ancient tree. Becky pressed her palm against the loose earth, feeling how cold and damp it was. She dug her fingers in and found not a root, not a rock, but the corner of something hard. Wood? Metal? She yanked her hand back, breath catching. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment she saw herself reflected in Ranger's eyes, small, scared, but defiant. What the hell is buried out here, Becky wondered, the question echoing as thunder rolled across the fields. For a long moment, she stayed crouched by the tree, rain plastering her hair to her face. Ranger pressed to her side. The storm howled, but she barely heard it. All she felt was the heartbeat of the old oak, the pulsing fear in her veins, and Ranger's steady warmth grounding her to the present. She didn't want to go back inside, not with whatever was hiding here still a mystery, not with Ranger so unsettled. Finally, Becky stood, wiping mud from her hands, her mind racing. She'd deal with it in the morning, she told herself, forcing her legs to move. For now, she dragged Ranger back toward the house, his ears still pricked, eyes locked on the tree. As she locked the door behind them, Becky glanced back through the fogged glass. The oak loomed, black and silent, guarding its secret through wind and rain. But she couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed. Some old wound ripped open, some hidden thing clawing its way to the surface. Ranger settled at the threshold, head resting on his paws, still watching the storm, still watching the tree. Becky hovered by the kitchen window, heart refusing to slow, every muscle tight as a bowstring. Alone in her farmhouse, surrounded by storm and darkness, she realized she was afraid, not just of what was outside, but of the past that refused to stay buried. The night dragged on, hour by hour, as Becky listened to the storm rage and Ranger's quiet, faithful breathing beside her. She didn't sleep. She waited for dawn, for answers, for the courage to face whatever secrets the old oak had guarded all these years. And outside, beneath the storm, the tree waited too. Dawn broke slowly, gray and reluctant, as if the sky itself was nursing a hangover from the storm. Becky hovered in the kitchen, coffee cooling in her hands, her thoughts still tangled in the night's fear and that persistent image of Ranger standing guard by the oak. He sat at the back door now, muscles tense, tail sweeping a steady rhythm across the faded linoleum. Becky didn't want to go outside, didn't want to face whatever waited under the old tree. But she had never been the type to let fear win for long. With a sigh, she grabbed her jacket, slipped on her mud-caked shoes, and whistled for Ranger. "Let's go see what you found, boy," she muttered, trying to sound braver than she felt. The yard was sodden, puddles glinting in the weak winter light. Ranger darted ahead, nose to the ground, drawing Becky straight to the oak without hesitation. The tree's base looked just as she remembered. Dirt churned up, bark gouged, roots exposed like broken fingers. Becky knelt, fingers numb, and began scraping at the soil with her hands. Ranger joined in, paws working beside hers with methodical determination. Each scoop of dirt made Becky's heart thump a little harder. Her hand struck something solid. She brushed away wet leaves and mud, revealing a corner of rusted metal. Carefully, she worked the object free. An old tin box, battered and sealed tight with a strip of oilcloth that had held up better than she expected. Becky's hands shook as she wiped it clean on her jeans. The box was surprisingly heavy. Whatever was inside had waited a long time. "Here goes nothing," she whispered, glancing at Ranger, who sat beside her, head cocked, eyes sharp and intent. With her fingernail, Becky pried up the latch. The box creaked open, hinges protesting after years in the dark. Inside, she found a neat stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a ribbon, a faded photograph tucked beneath, and a small, tarnished dog tag glinting in the morning light. She reached for the top envelope, fingers trembling. The handwriting was looping and elegant. Mary Harmon, 1943. And inside, words spilled across the page in ink faded to blue-gray. Becky's throat tightened as she read the first lines. "My dearest Elliot, the nights are long and lonely, but I hold tight to your promise beneath our oak." Becky stared at the tree above her, heart thudding. Suddenly, her own troubles seemed to shrink beneath the weight of history. She glanced at the photo. A young man in uniform, his arm around a smiling woman in a summer dress. The resemblance to the present was eerie. The oak, younger but unmistakable in the background, leaves full and green. She fished out the dog tag, turning it over in her palm. Elliot Harmon was stamped in the metal, the letters crisp and cold. Becky's reflection warped in its surface. The world seemed to hush, as if the tree, the box, even Ranger were holding their breath. She set the items gently in her lap and drew out another letter, its pages thinner, corners fraying. The second letter was shorter, hurried, words smudged and frantic. "If anything happens, you'll know where to look. Promise me under the tree. Don't let them forget." Becky's hands shook as she read. A different kind of ache bloomed in her chest. Not just loneliness, but the weight of longing that spanned generations. She swallowed, blinking hard, and reached for the next envelope. Mary's voice spilled out, full of fear and hope and the desperate wish that her words would last. With each letter, Becky felt the walls around her own heart begin to crack. She thought of her ex-husband, of all the silent nights spent waiting for someone to come home, of promises made and broken. The ache was old and familiar, but Mary's words sharpened it, reminding Becky that she was not the first to endure loss, nor would she be the last. As she finished the last letter, Becky sat back on her heels, the world spinning slightly. She looked at Ranger, who had settled beside her, chin resting on her thigh, warm and solid. His presence, so immediate and alive, was a balm for the ache Mary's words had left behind. Becky pressed the letters to her chest, staring up at the ancient oak. "A promise kept by the tree," she whispered. The phrase echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning. It sounded like a clue, a thread leading deeper into a story that had waited decades to be told. She gathered the contents of the box and started for the house, Ranger trailing close. Inside, Becky laid out the treasures on her kitchen table, the letters, the photo, the dog tag. She booted up her old laptop, hands moving almost without her permission. Athens wasn't a big town. Its history was a patchwork of family secrets and forgotten stories. But Becky knew where to start looking. She searched local archives, scrolling through military records and marriage licenses. Elliot Harmon had returned from the war. At least, that's what the records showed. Mary's name came up in census rolls, faded obituaries, and church bulletins, always tethered to that farmhouse, to that land. Becky's own heartbreak began to weave itself into theirs, a tapestry of sorrow and hope stitched across the years. Outside, the storm clouds parted, sunlight pooling on the oak's dripping branches. Becky pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the weight of the past pressing back. Ranger watched her, tail thumping, as if he too understood that they'd found something more than just old letters. They'd unearthed a promise, a piece of living memory, and Becky knew, deep in her bones, that the story wasn't finished yet. The tree held more secrets, and she would not rest until she'd uncovered them all. As dusk crept in, Becky reread the last letter one more time. "Don't let them forget." She stroked Ranger's fur, her own heart echoing Mary's plea, and promised herself that whatever lay beneath the roots of that old oak, she would bring it into the light. The rain was softer now, a steady drizzle that turned the world outside Becky's window to watercolor. Sunday passed with a hush, as if the farmhouse itself had sunk into contemplation. Becky sat at her kitchen table, the tin box at her elbow. Ranger curled in a protective circle at her feet. She ran her fingers over the old envelopes, tracing the faded ink, her mind circling the words she'd read a dozen times since dawn. Every detail was sharper in the quiet. Mary's pleas inked onto paper, Elliot's steady gaze in the photograph, the cold weight of the dog tag on the table. The storm had stripped away Becky's defenses. She felt raw, her own loneliness echoing Mary's, the ache of waiting for someone who might never come home. She read the letters again, aloud this time, her voice trembling in the empty kitchen. My dearest Elliot, the world is changed, but under our tree I remember your promise. Becky paused, swallowing, her eyes burning. She really believed he'd come back, Ranger. The dog looked up, his ears twitching, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe all dogs carried old secrets. Becky found herself speaking to Ranger more than she ever had. I guess we both know what it's like to wait for someone, huh? Ranger lifted his head, warm eyes meeting hers, a silent listener who never judged. Becky smiled, shaky but real. You know, you're the best roommate I've ever had. Not much of a talker, but I'll take it. The letters grew heavier with meaning as Becky read on. Mary's words painted a landscape of longing, nights haunted by the sound of trains, days when every knock at the door made her heart stutter. The farmhouse had once rung with laughter, with family and friends gathered around the kitchen table. Now, like Becky, it had settled into a quieter rhythm, haunted by memories it couldn't quite forget. After lunch, Becky opened her laptop and typed Elliot Harmon, Athens, Georgia, what? Into the search bar. She scrolled through grainy photos, military records, and old news clippings. A wedding announcement. Mary Jenkins to wed local hero Elliot Harmon, November 1944. A birth record. James Harmon, born 1947. There were fragments, but the whole story slipped through her fingers. She found herself drawn to the Athens Historical Society website. There was a brief mention in a 1980 newsletter. The Harmon Oak, so named for its role in local folklore, stands as a silent witness to homecomings and farewells. Legend says the tree holds the key to homecoming for those who've lost their way. Becky blinked at the screen, the words prickling at her memory. The tree holds the key, she murmured. It was almost as if someone, or something, wanted her to look deeper. Outside, Ranger scratched at the door. Becky let him out, watching as he trotted straight to the old oak, nose to the ground. He sniffed, pawed at the base, then sat and stared back at her, expectant. I know, there's more," Becky called, her breath fogging the glass. But today she didn't follow him. Today she just watched, heart too heavy to move. The afternoon faded into gray. Becky curled on the couch with the photograph, studying every detail. Elliot's smile was lopsided, his uniform crisp but wrinkled at the elbows. Mary stood beside him, eyes bright with hope, her hand resting on his arm. Behind them, the oak's branches stretched wide, leaves casting dappled shadows on their faces. Becky pressed the picture to her chest, wishing she could step back in time, slip between the years, and warn them how fragile happiness could be. A tear slid down Becky's cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away, embarrassed even though she was alone. Suddenly, Ranger nudged her knee, his big head heavy and warm. He licked the tear from her face, his rough tongue a gentle shock. "Hey," Becky laughed, voice catching. "Who gave you permission to play therapist?" But the gesture worked. Her breath came easier, the ache in her chest less sharp. She scratched Ranger's ears, grateful for the comfort he offered without words. Becky spent the rest of the day drifting through archives and memories, her thoughts weaving between past and present. She pictured Mary waiting for letters, flinching at every siren. She pictured Elliot overseas, clutching Mary's words in some muddy trench, the dog tag around his neck his only link to home. She saw herself reflected in both of them, a woman held together by hope and memory, longing for a promise kept. Evening crept in, and Becky pulled the old quilt over her shoulders. She thought of her ex-husband, how their love had begun with whispered promises under summer trees, and ended with silence in separate rooms. She wondered if Mary and Elliot had argued, if they'd doubted, if their love had survived the war and the years that followed. Or had Mary, too, ended up sitting alone beneath the oak, clutching letters that no longer brought comfort. Ranger curled at Becky's feet, his breathing slow and even. She rested her hand on his back, drawing strength from his quiet presence. "We're in this together, you and me," she whispered. Ranger sighed, a deep, contented rumble, and Becky let herself believe it was true. The house was silent, but not empty. Becky felt the weight of the past all around her, the laughter, the sorrow, the promises whispered beneath the old tree. She knew she couldn't turn away now, couldn't pretend the story in her hands was finished. The tree, the letters, the photograph, they were threads leading somewhere, and Becky was determined to follow. As night fell and the rain returned, Becky drifted into uneasy sleep, Ranger standing vigil at her side. Outside, the oak waited, its roots tangled deep in the soil, its secrets stirring just beneath the surface, ready to be unearthed. Nights in the farmhouse always felt a little haunted. But since the discovery under the old oak, Becky's dreams had taken on a strange life of their own. She woke before dawn, heart pounding. Memories of nameless soldiers and thunderous storms tangled with flashes of Ranger standing sentinel beneath the tree. The image lingered in her mind, his broad, sturdy frame outlined by moonlight, gaze unwavering as if he alone could ward off whatever ghosts circled their world. The next morning, Becky found herself restless, wandering the kitchen and peering out the window. Ranger watched her every move, tail thumping now and then, eyes full of intelligence and something else, a gravity she hadn't noticed before. The farmhouse felt different, less empty somehow, but also heavier with old stories pressing in from the dark. By mid-morning, Becky needed answers, or at least another voice to break up the silence. She bundled up and walked across the muddy yard to her neighbor's house. A sagging Victorian painted a brave shade of yellow, the porch crowded with wind chimes and potted herbs. Mrs. Arnett, her nearest neighbor and a living repository of local legend, opened the door before Becky even knocked. "Well, if it isn't my favorite night owl," Mrs. Arnett greeted, ushering her in. Her living room smelled of cinnamon and lavender, with sunlight pooling on stacks of battered books. Becky hesitated, unsure where to start. "I found something," she began, "under the old Harmon oak. Letters, a photograph, dog tags from the war. I think there's more to that tree than anyone realizes." Mrs. Arnett's face grew thoughtful. "My father used to talk about that tree, said it was planted before the war, and that something about it made folks feel safe. He told me stories, Becky. Stories about a guardian dog, always there when something important was happening, always watching." Becky smiled despite herself. "That sounds like Ranger. He's been glued to my side ever since. Well, ever since the divorce, really. But lately, it's like he's waiting for something. Or someone." Mrs. Arnett poured tea, her hands steady. "Fear has a way of settling in after life's storms. But sometimes, the ones who watch over us are the ones who help us move forward." She glanced out her own window, where a rusted wind vane spun. "My father left me something too. Said to keep it safe in case the right person ever needed it." She disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a small, rusty key on a faded ribbon. "He found it by that tree in '64. Never knew what it opened, but he always said it belonged to the story of that place." Mrs. Arnett pressed the key into Becky's palm, fingers warm and reassuring. "I think the story's yours now." Becky swallowed, feeling a strange responsibility settle over her. Thank you. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next, but it feels like something's waking up, like the past wants to be seen. Mrs. Arnett smiled, lines crinkling around her eyes. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen, dear. The rest finds you. Back at the farmhouse, the air felt charged. Becky spent the day cleaning and sorting, trying to focus on chores, but her mind kept wandering to the key, to the oak, to the idea of guardian dogs passed through generations. That night, she tried to settle with a book, but the words blurred on the page. She fell asleep on the sofa. Ranger curled beside her. Becky's dreams returned. Flashes of soldiers in tattered uniforms, boots sinking in Georgia mud, whispers of names she'd never heard. Each time Ranger appeared, sometimes younger, sometimes older, but always the same loyal presence. When she startled awake just after midnight, the house was hushed, shadows long and deep. She heard Ranger's claws on the kitchen tile, an urgent, scraping sound. Becky slipped off the sofa, heart hammering, and followed. Ranger stood at the back door, head low, every muscle tense. He stared through the glass into the pitch-black yard, unwavering, the same way she'd seen him in her dreams. A knot of fear twisted in Becky's chest. "What do you see, boy?" she whispered, reaching for his ruff. Ranger didn't move, didn't so much as flick an ear. He was utterly focused on the oak, standing in the darkness, leaves shifting in the slight wind. Becky's breath fogged the glass, her reflection wavering. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a shadow moved. Just the wind, she told herself. But Ranger pressed closer, body rigid, as if he could hold back the night itself. Becky felt something old and powerful pass between them. A sense of guardianship that stretched beyond words or even memory. Eventually, the night passed. Ranger relaxed, curling up at the door, still keeping one watchful eye on the oak. Becky barely slept, heart full of questions and a strange, budding hope. By morning, the world was quiet again. The storm scrubbed from the sky. Becky stood at the door with the key Mrs. Arnett had given her, feeling the weight of history and possibility in her palm. She understood now. Some promises were never meant to be broken, some stories never meant to be silenced. As sunlight spilled over the yard, Becky bent down to Ranger, brushing her fingers through his fur. "You ready to find out what's next?" Ranger licked her hand, tail sweeping the floor. A silent yes. Whatever secrets the oak still held, Becky knew she wasn't alone anymore. Ranger would stand guard, and she would face the past, whatever it revealed, head on, with courage she hadn't known she possessed. The rusty key from Mrs. Arnett was heavier than it looked, rough with age, its teeth blunted by time. Becky turned it over in her hand as she stood on the back porch, Ranger pacing at her feet, the air brisk with the promise of coming rain. All night she'd dreamed of locks and doors, secrets twisting behind them, the sensation of something just out of reach. Now, with the pale morning sun cresting over the Athens fields, the old oak waited, silent and solemn, as if it had always known she would come. Becky's boots sank into the soft ground as she crossed the yard. Every step was a negotiation between anticipation and dread. Ranger trotted ahead, stopping only to glance back, urging her forward. The oak loomed larger the closer she got, its roots like the knuckles of some great hand gripping the earth, its trunk scarred and furrowed with decades of storms. She knelt at the base, pushing aside damp leaves and reaching for the place where she and Ranger had unearthed the tin box days before. Her fingers skimmed the bark, searching for a notch, a hollow. Anything that would explain why Mrs. Arnett's father had told her to save the key for someone who'd need it. Then she found it. A narrow slit between two roots, half hidden by moss. Her breath caught. With shaking hands, Becky inserted the key. It slid in with a strange, satisfying resistance. She turned it, hearing a muffled click, and the mossy panel shifted open, revealing a cavity within the tree itself. Nestled inside was a small, iron-bound box and an old folded map. She pulled both out carefully, heart drumming in her ears. The box was locked, but the map, creased, faded, edges crumbling, unfolded easily in her lap. Becky's eyes widened as she studied the hand-drawn lines. Familiar streets of Athens, certain locations marked with tiny red X's. One X stood out, circled in black ink, labeled Barn South Road. Beneath it, a single word in elegant script, Safe House. The sense of unease was immediate and sharp. Becky felt as if she'd stepped into a story that didn't quite belong to her. An interloper trespassing through the memories of others. She pressed the map to her chest, glancing over her shoulder. The yard felt less empty. Someone, or something, was watching. A crunch of gravel broke the silence. Becky's head snapped up, adrenaline flashing through her veins. At the edge of her yard, a tall figure stood, silhouetted against the road. He wore a broad hat, his coat flapping in the breeze, eyes shadowed but intent. Ranger's ears went back. He moved between Becky and the stranger, fur bristling, body rigid. The man took a step forward, hands raised, but didn't cross onto Becky's property. "You Harmon's kin?" he called, voice rough, southern drawl thick. Becky swallowed, nerves jangling. "No, I just live here. Who are you?" "Name's Wyatt. My granddad fought with Elliot Harmon." He hesitated, scanning her face for a lie. "Folks say you're digging up things that ought to stay buried." A flash of irritation bolted through Becky, pushing aside her fear. "I'm not looking to hurt anyone," she said, rising to her feet. "But these aren't just secrets. They're history. People deserve to know." Wyatt's gaze dropped to Ranger, who was holding his ground, lips peeled back in a low, steady growl. "Your dog's got spirit," Wyatt muttered, almost approving. "Just be careful. There are some around here who think the past should stay in the ground." With that, he turned and strode off, boots crunching against the road. Becky let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, heart hammering with a cocktail of fear and defiance. Ranger nuzzled her leg, reassuring and vigilant. She slipped the box and map into her backpack and hurried back inside, every window suddenly feeling like an exposed nerve. She locked the door behind her, chest tight, and paced the living room, trying to calm her racing mind. Ranger followed, his gaze never leaving the windows, his presence anchoring her to the present. Becky unfolded the map again, tracing the route to the barn on South Road with her finger. Why a safe house? Who had hidden these things? And what was so important about the barn? For hours, Becky debated what to do. The presence of the stranger, Wyatt, unsettled her. Was he a threat? Or just another guardian, bound to the secrets of this land by blood and memory? She thought about the war, the coded letters, the idea of silent helpers hiding in plain sight. Maybe the past wasn't dead at all. Maybe it lived on in everyone who remembered, who chose to act. The sky darkened as rain threatened again. Becky put on her jacket, steeling herself. She wrote a note for Mrs. Arnett, just in case, and stuffed it in her pocket. With the locked box, the map, and Ranger at her side, she set out for South Road, her breath frosting in the chilly afternoon air. The walk was long and lonely, the road empty, the world hushed except for the sound of Ranger's paws and Becky's heart beating. By the time she reached the old barn, dusk was settling in, gold and blue shadows falling across broken fence posts and tangled weeds. Becky hesitated outside the weathered door, hand on the iron latch. Ranger stood at her side, his eyes bright, ready for whatever waited inside. She thought of all the people who'd come before, Mary and Elliot, the unknown helpers, the generations who'd kept silent out of love or fear. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dark, musty air. The barn seemed to exhale, boards creaking, dust swirling in the thin beam of her flashlight. Becky's footsteps echoed on the old planks as she made her way forward, the locked box heavy in her bag, the key still warm in her hand. Behind her, Ranger sniffed the air, tail held high. Becky felt the weight of eyes, living and gone, watching her every move. For the first time, she realized she was not afraid. The past had called her here, and she would see it through. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn's tin roof. Becky squared her shoulders and stepped into the darkness, ready to face whatever secrets the safe house had guarded for so long. The barn at the end of South Road had once been painted red, but decades of Georgia sun and rain had stripped it to bare wood and rusted tin. Becky stood before it, heart pounding, the map's faded X burned into her memory. Beside her, Ranger sniffed the chill evening air, his tail a cautious metronome, his posture tense with anticipation. Dusk pressed close, deepening every shadow and lending the barn an air of hallowed secrecy. Becky tightened her grip on her flashlight and pushed open the creaking door. It swung wide with a protesting groan, dust motes swirling in the thin shaft of light. The air inside was thick with old hay, mildew, and something metallic. Her boots echoed on the warped boards as she stepped inside, Ranger close to her hip, their twin shadows stretching long and thin across the straw-strewn floor. The barn was bigger than it looked from the outside, the beams overhead black with age. Half the roof had caved in near the back, letting a band of dying daylight slice through the gloom. Becky's flashlight beam caught on stacks of broken crates, rusted farm equipment, a toppled tricycle whose paint had long since faded. Everything looked frozen in time, untouched since the day the doors were last closed. She reached into her bag and pulled out the iron-bound box and the folded map, laying them on an overturned barrel. Ranger sniffed the ground, then nudged a loose floorboard with his nose, snorting softly. "Good boy," Becky whispered, crouching beside him. With the flashlight wedged under her arm, she pried at the edge of the board. It shifted with a sharp crack, splinters pricking her fingers. Beneath it, packed in straw, was an old leather diary, its cover buckled with age. Becky's breath caught. Another relic, another piece of the puzzle. She carefully lifted it out, brushing away the dirt. The initials E.H. were etched into the cover, Elliot Harmon. She opened to the first page, the script elegant but hurried. March 1945. "We move tonight. The safe house is ready, thanks to Mary's warning. Ranger stands guard. If I do not return, let it be known that this place sheltered more than just soldiers. It sheltered hope." Becky read on, pulse racing. The diary detailed late-night arrivals, coded messages, families who risked everything to hide escaped prisoners of war, and returning GIs. Names she recognized from town council meetings appeared alongside stories of danger and quiet heroism. Elliot wrote of Ranger, not the same dog, Becky realized, but another German shepherd, always present, always loyal, whose name had been passed down like a secret. She felt the world shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just a family's history. It was the story of a community, its fears and its courage, woven together by acts of compassion kept hidden for decades. Ranger pawed again at the floor. Becky followed his gaze to another loose plank, this one heavier. She pried it up, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was an old photograph. Becky wiped it clean, heart thudding. The image showed Elliot Harmon standing with a group of men and women in front of the very barn where she now stood. At his side, unmistakable even in sepia tones, was a German shepherd. The same piercing eyes, the same proud stance as her own ranger. A shiver ran through Becky. The diary called the dog Ranger, too, describing him as the guardian and silent messenger, moving between homes, guiding those in danger. The notes grew poetic at times, Elliot writing as if the dog was something more than flesh and blood, a protector whose presence meant the difference between hope and despair. Becky's hands trembled as she turned another page. Tucked between the diary's final entries was a folded slip of paper, its ink blocky and unfamiliar. The language was German, the words sharp and foreign. Becky's fingers fumbled for her phone, searching for a translation app. She typed in the words, heart in her throat. Do not forget the helpers. Their kindness is the greatest victory. The coded message made Becky's throat tighten. She thought of the old families in Athens, the neighbors who'd risked everything, and how silence had been both protection and curse. She pressed her back against the cool barn wall, breathing in the weight of memory. Ranger sat beside her, his head resting on her thigh, as if to anchor her to the present. Suddenly, headlights swept across the barn walls. Becky froze, heartbeat hammering. Was it Wyatt, come to warn her again? Or someone else, angry that old secrets had been disturbed? The car idled outside. Becky reached for Ranger's collar, ready to flee if needed. But the door creaked and a voice called. An elderly woman, her accent unmistakable even through the barn's echo. Is someone there, Becky? It was Mrs. Arnett, holding a lantern high, concern etched deep in her face. Becky sagged in relief. I'm here, she called, stepping into the light. Mrs. Arnett peered at the objects spread across the barrel. My father always wondered if anyone would find those, she said quietly. This was more than a barn, Becky. It was a crossing, a place where fear and hope met in the dark. Becky nodded, emotion tightening her throat. There's more, Mrs. Arnett. The diary, the coded message, it's all here. People need to know what really happened. Mrs. Arnett squeezed Becky's hand, her eyes shining. You're the one to tell it. Maybe that's why Ranger found you. The guardian always comes when memories are at risk. As the night deepened, Becky felt something inside her settle. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The past had called, and she had answered, not just for herself, but for the town, for Mary and Elliot, for every silent helper who'd chosen hope in the darkest of days. Morning came pale and cold. Becky barely slept, haunted by new names and old faces swirling through her dreams. The barn had revealed so much. Elliot's diary, the faded photograph, the coded message that rang like a warning across decades. Still, as dawn crept through the curtains, Becky knew there was more. The safe house was only one piece. Athens itself, quiet and picturesque on the surface, held deeper secrets. Becky spent the morning scanning diary pages and translating passages, her laptop surrounded by a growing archive. Letters, maps, photographs, and Ranger's old dog tag. As she worked, she felt the story growing larger than herself, heavy with consequences. Every fact was another thread pulled, unraveling a history people had tried to forget. The news spread quickly. By noon, whispers ran through town like fire. Becky fielded cautious phone calls, neighbors dropping hints about family names in that diary, or wondering aloud if some things weren't better left in the shadows. But she pressed on, drafting an email to the Athens Historical Society and organizing her findings. The urge to hide, to let the story sleep again, pulled at her. But the greater pull was the need to finish what she had started. That afternoon, the town council called an emergency meeting at the old community hall. Becky arrived with her box of relics, Ranger at her side. The hall was packed. Young families, old-timers, teachers, and a handful of local reporters. Eyes followed her as she crossed the room, whispers rising, suspicion mixing with curiosity. Wyatt stood at the back, arms folded, jaw tight. Becky met his gaze, steady and unafraid. She was done running from the past. Mayor Layton banged the gavel. "We're here because Miss Porter's research may affect the legacy of this town. Some of our ancestors," he paused, scanning the crowd, "are named in her documents. We need to hear what she's found." Becky stood, heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room could hear it. She lifted Elliot's diary, the photograph, and Ranger's dog tag. "This isn't just about my farmhouse or my curiosity," she began. "It's about truth. It's about the lives our grandparents lived, the choices they made, good or bad. I found letters and diaries that proved the Harmon barn was a safe house. It sheltered returning GIs, escaped POWs and their families, thanks to the courage of ordinary people." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the front, an older woman, covered her mouth with her hands, eyes shining. "Some of you are afraid these stories might shame our town," Becky continued, voice trembling but strong. "But courage in dark times isn't something to be ashamed of, and neither is the truth. Our history belongs to everyone, not just the winners, but the helpers, the forgotten, the silent heroes." Wyatt raised his hand, voice rough. "You got proof, Porter? Or is this just another story?" Becky held up the diary. "Elliot Harmon wrote it. Names, dates, everything. There's even a coded message from a German POW thanking the families who helped him. And look." She turned the photograph for all to see. The image of Elliot, the townspeople, and the German shepherd by the barn. Pride and defiance clear in their faces. A tense silence fell. Becky waited, the air thick with anticipation. Then the old woman in the front row stood up. "My father was one of those helpers," she said quietly, voice trembling with age and memory. "He never talked about it, but he kept a medal hidden in his sock drawer. He always said helping was the right thing, even if nobody thanked you." One by one, others spoke. Some confessed to memories passed down in secret. Stories of midnight knocks, strangers hiding in root cellars, dogs who seemed to know when to bark and when to keep silent. The shame the town feared began to melt away, replaced by a swelling pride, a sense of belonging to something larger. But not everyone was ready to embrace the past. Several townsfolk grumbled, shifting uncomfortably. "Why dig up old trouble?" one man muttered. "What good does it do, airing all this now?" Becky met his eyes, refusing to back down. "Because forgetting is a kind of loss. And if we let these stories vanish, we lose the best parts of ourselves. History isn't a weapon. It's a lesson." At her side, Ranger sat tall, gaze unwavering, his calm presence steadying Becky when her voice faltered. The town was silent, considering. Finally, Wyatt stepped forward, face grave. "There's a stone wall down by the river. My granddad used to say it's where they carved their initials when a job was done. Maybe that's where your story ends." The old woman nodded. "I remember. My father took me there once. Said it was a secret memorial for those who carried hope home." Becky felt her chest tighten, something between relief and anticipation. "Then that's where I'll go next." As the meeting ended, quiet allies surrounded her, pressing her hands, whispering encouragement. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, the river flashing silver in the distance. Becky looked down at Ranger, who wagged his tail as if to say, "You did well." Walking home, Becky felt lighter, the burden of silence finally shared. The town was changing, memories flickering back to life like fireflies at dusk. There was one last place to go, one more secret waiting beneath stone and moss. At sunset, Becky paused beneath the old oak, feeling Ranger lean against her. She realized that facing the truth hadn't brought shame or trouble. It had brought healing, and a chance for the whole town to remember what it truly meant to be home. The riverbank had always felt like a place apart, cool, secretive, the rush of water smoothing away the noise of the world. That afternoon, Becky made her way down the winding path with Ranger trotting at her side and a small group of townsfolk following behind. Word of the council meeting had spread quickly. Now, instead of whispers and doubt, there was a quiet determination in the air, as if the whole community had decided to face the truth together, no matter where it led. The old stone wall appeared through the trees, half sunk in wild grass and brambles. It was taller than Becky remembered from childhood, pitted and gray with age. But as she brushed aside vines and moss, she could see it was covered in initials, names, and dates, layers upon layers, some so faint you could barely make them out, others carved deep and bold. She ran her fingers over the stone, feeling the grooves left by hands from another century. Ranger sniffed along the base, tail wagging, before giving a short bark. Becky knelt beside him, brushing dirt away from the roots of a crooked sapling that had forced its way between two stones. Her heart jumped as her fingers struck metal, a rusty latch. With trembling hands, she dug away the soil, and together with Wyatt and Mrs. Arnett, pried loose the cornerstone. Behind it, hidden from sight for generations, was a battered wooden chest, its hinges swollen with age. The group fell silent, the only sounds the rush of the river and the whisper of wind through the grass. Becky glanced around, faces full of hope, fear, and longing, then lifted the chest into the open. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the latch, finally snapping it free. Inside, the past seemed to breathe. There were medals, dull with time but still gleaming faintly, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a hand-stitched ledger thick with names and dates, and at the very top, an envelope addressed simply, "To those who remember." With reverent care, Becky opened it and read aloud. "To those who come after, if you are reading this, know that what was done here was done for love, not only for family, but for neighbors and strangers alike. In our darkest days, hope found a home in Athens. The men and women whose names are written here risked everything, not for glory, but because it was right. Do not let that courage be forgotten." Elliot Harmon, 1945. A hush fell over the group. Tears shone in Mrs. Arnett's eyes. Wyatt cleared his throat, voice rough with emotion. "That's my granddad's signature. I never knew what he carried. Not really." He reached for the ledger, opening it so that the crowd could see. Pages upon pages were filled with names, some familiar, others lost to time, each a testament to sacrifice and quiet bravery. Becky watched as families pressed forward, searching for their own history. An elderly man gasped, tracing a name with a shaking finger. "That's my mother," he whispered. "She never talked about it. She just made sure we were safe." Others found fathers, uncles, aunts, long-lost relatives memorialized not for violence but for sheltering, guiding, protecting. Children, sensing the gravity of the moment, grew quiet, huddling close as adults wept openly or held one another. Becky felt her throat close with emotion, as she realized this was bigger than any story or scandal. This was the soul of the town, at last uncovered, allowed to breathe. Beside her, Ranger nudged her hand, then sat tall, chest out, as if he understood his part in all this. Becky hugged him, tears stinging her eyes. "We did it, buddy. We brought them home." The mayor, wiping his eyes, addressed the group. "It's time this place became more than a forgotten corner. I propose we turn this site into a living memorial, a place where every story, every name, can be remembered with pride." The idea was met with murmurs of agreement, heads nodding, hands squeezing in silent support. Plans took shape right there, as if they'd been waiting for decades to be spoken aloud. Families offered artifacts. Kids sketched ideas for plaques and storyboards. Mrs. Arnett volunteered to share her father's letters and the rusty key. Becky saw in the crowd the faces of those who doubted, now transformed by the knowledge that their community had always stood for something greater. As the sun dipped low, the first stones for the new memorial were set beside the wall. Children, solemn and serious, planted a young oak tree in the soft earth, their hands working together. It was a moment of closure and of promise, an unbroken line stretching from the past through the present, carried by everyone gathered there. Becky stepped back and let herself cry, not from grief, but from relief and gratitude. She saw Ranger watching her, amber eyes wise and gentle. She dropped to her knees and held him, burying her face in his fur, feeling his heart beat steady and sure against her cheek. It struck her that she, too, was now part of this story. Not just a keeper of secrets, but a link in the chain of guardianship. Those who watch, remember, and ensure that kindness is never lost to silence. As dusk painted the river gold, Becky stood with her neighbors in a circle around the sapling and the old wall. Hands joined, stories shared. The community promised aloud to honor every name and lesson. A new chapter was beginning. Not just for the people of Athens, but for every child, every outsider, every future guardian who would someday find their own story written in stone and shade. And at the edge of the gathering, Ranger sat beneath the new oak, tail curled around his paws, a silent sentinel in the fading light, watchful, loyal, and ready for whatever the future might bring. A week after the discovery by the river, Athens gathered for a day unlike any other in its history. The town was alive with a new energy, hopeful, lighter, as if the secrets set free by the riverbank had swept out decades of silence and shame. Becky walked through the early morning mist toward the old stone wall, feeling more herself than she had in years. Her arms were full. She carried a stack of programs for the dedication ceremony, a jar of wildflowers for the memorial, and the diary of Elliot Harmon pressed close to her chest. Children's laughter echoed up from the river, where a crowd had already begun to gather. Ranger trotted at Becky's side, tail wagging, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents of barbecues and fresh paint. The new oak tree, planted by the children just days before, stood straight and hopeful beside the ancient wall. Its leaves shimmered with dew, promising growth, memory, and endurance. Rows of folding chairs filled the grass, every seat claimed. Old men in Sunday suits, young mothers holding infants, high schoolers in team jackets. Every face reflected anticipation and something gentler, pride. Local bakers had brought pies. Church ladies arranged flowers. A troop of scouts polished the bronze plaque now affixed to the stone wall, the words carefully chosen by the community. Becky took her seat in the front row, knees trembling with excitement and nerves. Mrs. Arnett squeezed her hand. Wyatt tipped his hat from across the aisle, a soft smile breaking his usual reserve. Ranger settled at Becky's feet, his eyes sharp and gentle, content just to be with her. The mayor stepped up to the new podium, voice ringing out over the crowd. Today, we do more than dedicate a monument. We honor a legacy of courage, kindness, and quiet heroism. For too long, our history slept beneath stone and earth. Thanks to many, especially Becky Porter and her faithful friend Ranger, we now remember, and we honor every story. A hush fell as Becky was called to speak. She stood slowly, heart pounding, the weight of the moment settling around her like a warm blanket. The new oak's shadow touched her feet, as if inviting her to draw strength from its roots. Becky glanced at the faces before her, then at the old stone wall, crowded with initials, dates, and stories. She took a breath and began, her voice clear and steady. When I first moved back to Athens, I was lost, lonely, carrying hurts I thought I'd never shake. I thought this farmhouse and this land would be a quiet place to disappear. But the past doesn't stay silent forever. When Ranger barked that first stormy night, I had no idea he was leading me to something bigger than either of us. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd as Ranger thumped his tail, seemingly on cue. Becky continued, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't bother to hide. The letters, the diary, the secrets hidden beneath this very ground. They were never just about war or hiding. They were about love, about neighbors risking everything for each other, about children planting trees whose shade they might never sit beneath, and about the guardians, human and animal, who make sure the past isn't lost to silence. She looked at the children sitting cross-legged on the grass, their eyes wide. We honor courage not just in metals or stone, but in stories we share and in kindness we pass on. I hope every child here will remember that the smallest act of bravery, welcoming a stranger, sharing a meal, telling the truth, can ripple through generations. The crowd grew quiet, the lessons settling into their hearts. Mrs. Arnett dabbed her eyes. Wyatt stood a little straighter, the sun glinting off the bronze plaque behind him. As the ceremony closed, the children of Athens gathered around the new oak, each holding a white stone inscribed with a name or message, some for family, some for strangers, some for the hope that the world could be kinder. One by one, they laid the stones in a circle around the tree's base, voices mingling in the summer air. Ranger sat among them, patient and calm, his loyalty as much a part of the story as any diary or plaque. Several children reached out to pet him, giggling as he licked their hands or leaned into their touch. In that moment, Becky saw the full circle, how healing began not just with discovery, but with sharing, with letting stories take root in the hearts of those who'd never known the wounds of the past. The mayor called for silence, and together the community recited the dedication, voices rising in unity. Let memory guide us. Let courage inspire us. Let kindness unite us. Here we remember, always. The plaque gleamed in the sunlight, its words etched deep into bronze and stone. Becky felt peace at last, a sense that her place in Athens had been carved not by her own history, but by the way she'd chosen to help others remember theirs. As the crowd dispersed, some lingering to share stories, some wandering to the river's edge, Becky stayed behind. She traced the initials on the wall, remembering Mary and Elliot, the helpers, the hidden, the hopeful. She knelt by Ranger, stroking his fur, whispering her thanks for the journey they'd shared. She understood now. Healing didn't come from hiding or forgetting, but from facing the past with open eyes and an open heart. The legacy left by the guardians, human and animal, would last not just in stone, but in every act of courage, kindness, and truth that followed. Under the spreading oak, with Ranger at her side, Becky looked out at Athens and saw not just a town, but a living story, a promise kept, a memory cherished, a lesson written not just in stone, but in the very hearts of its people. Months slipped by, marked by seasons changing along the riverbank, and laughter drifting through Athens' once quiet streets. Where there had been only moss and silence, the new memorial blossomed, a place for memory and gathering, alive with the colors of fresh wildflowers and the sturdy shade of the young oak tree. The story Becky had unearthed grew beyond her, becoming a living part of the town, as natural and necessary as the river itself. The memorial was never empty now. Even on gray afternoons, children ran circles around the oak, their shouts echoing between the stones. Elders gathered for coffee on the wooden benches, sharing stories both old and new. School groups came with sketchbooks and questions, filling the air with wonder. Tourists drifted through, touched by the unique pride and quiet strength in Athens's collective heart. Ranger, his muzzle now silvered by age, remained a familiar sight among the crowds. He seemed to know every child by name, greeting them with a wagging tail and patient eyes. He watched over their games as faithfully as he had guarded Becky on those stormy nights long ago. To the little ones, Ranger became more than just a dog. He was a gentle hero, a living link to stories that might have vanished if not for his vigilant heart. One autumn afternoon, Becky sat beneath the spreading oak with Ranger resting beside her, his head on her lap. A light breeze danced through the leaves, carrying laughter and the scent of fresh-cut grass. Becky's gaze traveled over the stones, each inscribed with names and memories, then settled on a small group near the base of the memorial, a mother comforting her young daughter, tears streaking the child's cheeks. Becky rose quietly, Ranger lumbering to his feet at her side, and approached the pair. She knelt beside them, offering a gentle smile. "Hi there, I'm Becky, and this is Ranger. Is there someone you'd like to remember today?" The mother nodded, voice soft and unsteady. "Her grandfather. He was one of the helpers, we think. She's just missing him a lot today." Becky stroked Ranger's head, her own voice steady and soothing. "You know, when Ranger and I first came here, we didn't know anyone's story. But we found them, one by one, in the ground, in old letters, in the hearts of people who remembered. That's how love lasts, honey. It doesn't end. It just changes where you find it." The little girl wiped her tears and reached out, burying her hands in Ranger's thick fur. Ranger nudged her gently, licking her fingers, his eyes soft and full of understanding. The child managed a wobbly smile, clinging to the comfort that only a loyal dog can give. As the sun dipped lower, townspeople began to gather, each holding a smooth stone. Some had painted names, others only a single word or symbol, a heart, a tree, a paw print. Becky watched as, one by one, people came forward, placing their stones in a widening circle around the oak. Wyatt carried his grandfather's medal, resting it on a patch of moss. Mrs. Arnett pressed an old letter to the roots, lips moving in a silent prayer. The children, faces serious in the golden light, whispered wishes for the future. When it was Becky's turn, she stood and faced the crowd, heart pounding but full of purpose. Ranger sat at her heel, as steadfast as ever. "We come here," Becky began, her voice carrying across the gathering, "not just to look back, but to carry forward. Our stories, our kindness, our courage, they matter most when we share them. We honor every name, every silent hero by living their lessons. Be a guardian for someone else. Speak up for what's right. Welcome those who need shelter. Remember that every act of love leaves a mark that outlasts us all." Heads nodded, tears glistened, arms reached out to link hands. In that circle, beneath the broad branches of the new oak, Athens was more than a place. It was a promise renewed, a living testament to everything they had survived and everything they hoped yet to become. The ceremony ended as dusk settled. Lanterns flickered to life, casting soft halos over the memorial stones. People lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of community, the comfort of shared remembrance. Becky wandered the grounds, pausing to listen to laughter, to comfort those who mourned, to gather new stories as they began to sprout like wildflowers. Later that night, as the last guests left and the candles burned low, Becky remained beneath the oak. Ranger sat beside her, his graying head lifted to catch the breeze. For a long while they watched the stars emerge, the hush of night returning to the river's edge. Becky spoke softly, as if to the wind, to all those who had come before and all those who would come after. Thank you for letting me be part of this story, for teaching me that hope is not just found in what we uncover, but in what we choose to share. She felt a sense of peace settle inside her, the ache of old wounds replaced by gratitude and connection. The farmhouse no longer felt haunted. Instead, it pulsed with the heartbeat of 100 stories, all woven together by courage, memory, and the silent watchfulness of a loyal dog. As Ranger's eyelids drooped, Becky rested her hand on his side. You've been the best guardian anyone could hope for, and your story, our story, will keep on growing, just like this tree. The final image, as the stars brightened overhead, was of Becky and Ranger beneath the oak, two guardians, eyes shining with memory and hope, ready to watch over all the stories still waiting to be told.